Yeah, thank you. Thank you all for coming out. Alan pretty well gave a summary of who we are. Welcome to UTM students, faculty, staff. You may or may not know that we have been at UTM since 2003, holding meetings for the public, for students. We actually now hold an annual star party on the North Field, usually in the fall. But I did want to say that locally nearby is the Riverwood Conservancy, and we have been holding monthly public star parties there since I think 2009 or 2008. So anyway, we're very busy, and all you have to do is go to the website, our RASC website under events, and you can catch up on what we're doing. So again, welcome. All right. You're new to this AD thing. Zoom. Okay. I want to introduce our speaker. It looks like many of you are here because you know him, probably know a lot more about him than I do. We were talking over dinner about when we first met, and in the description, his bio, he talks about giving more than 850 radio and TV interviews. And I think the first time we met, we were being interviewed on a CBC, I think it was TV, on some shuttle launch or something like that. And so I've known Robert for a long time, and we got together again just last April at the Discovery Channel's 30th anniversary, and it was good to see him. And that's when I talked to Ivan Semenik to come and give a talk, which he did a little while ago. And then I lined up Robert as well. All I can say is I love talking to Robert because he's just so knowledgeable and he brings up so many cool things. And even at dinner, we were talking about some pretty cool stuff. You didn't come to hear me talk. Ladies and gentlemen, our speaker, Robert Sawyer, and his topic is his title, "The New Life and New Civilizations: A Science Fiction Perspective on Exobiology." Thanks, Robert.
Oh, thank you, Brad. Thank you, man. Thank you. Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you for coming out. Horrible weather. And so I'm very grateful that you made the trek. Let me just get my notes in front of me here. Nothing wants to work tonight. So they have a green background on behind me, as you can see. And rather than allow them to drop in any green screen background that they might like, I decided to deface it with my website, sfwriter.com. I'm proud of the fact that I was the first science fiction writer in the world to have a website, the first Canadian author of any type to have a website. It's 31 years old now, from 1995, all hand-coded in HTML and WordStar for DOS. That's how old the website is. So if you want to know more about me and you don't already, go to sfwriter.com. You got to get on the ground floor if you want to get a URL like sfwriter. And indeed I did. Space, the final frontier. These are the voyages of UTM campus to explore strange new worlds, to seek out new life and new civilizations. Now, as many of you probably know, this year is the 60th anniversary of Star Trek, but it's actually the 60th. Yes, indeed. Let's have it out here for the Brave New World of Star Trek. It's actually 62 years since Gene Roddenberry sat down and composed his pitch for Star Trek. And Frank Drake had been in the news. He'd already done the Arecibo SETI message at that point. And even talking a lot about extraterrestrial civilizations, whether we might ever discover any of them. And Roddenberry had heard of the Drake equation. But this is 1964. There was no internet. There was no ARPANET even. There was nothing except trying to find the Drake equation. And so he could use it in his pitch document for Star Trek to try and sell the TV series. Couldn't find it, so he made one up. He just typed a whole bunch of symbols on his typewriter, actually had his secretary. His secretary, by the way, was D.C. Fontana, who went on to write some of the best Star Trek episodes. Journey to Babel interviewed Spock's parents, most famously among them. But she typed up superscripts and asterisks and all whatever you could find on a manual typewriter back then, and made up this thing and said, here's the formula scientists use to suggest that the universe and our galaxy is teeming with life. Now, I've always found that equation interesting. I'll just point out that ultimately they ended up in one of the later Star Trek series actually using that equation on a computer screen to give it legitimacy in the Star Trek universe alongside Frank Drake's actual equation. So the two great analyses of why the universe might be teeming with life, one of which is absolute gibberish. But I'm always afraid that the other one might be absolute gibberish too. I had the pleasure of having lunch with Frank Drake, 16 years ago now, at the SETI Institute's first SETICon. They did two of them, 2010 and 2012. I was privileged. I was the only science fiction writer invited to these California colloquia, and I had lunch with Frank one day. Great, interesting man, very humble, totally unprepared for, I think, how big the Drake equation became. But both of my parents were statisticians. And in fact, they both worked at the University of Toronto. This campus didn't exist at that time. My mother was at the Scarborough campus. My dad was downtown at the main campus. But if I had come up with the Drake equation as a kid, it came up when I was 5 years old, is when it was actually first published. If I had put that out in front of my parents and said, here is a good argument for why extraterrestrial life is probably pervasive throughout the universe, they would have sent me to bed without my supper because I was extrapolating from a sample of one. And any good statistician knows you can't do that. There is no way to extrapolate anything from a single sample. So that's absolutely true that we want to believe that the universe is teeming with interesting life forms. And certainly we science fiction writers catch in on that notion that there might be all kinds of strange new worlds and new life and new civilizations. Whether that is actually true or not is still entirely a moot point, meaning moot open for discussion, not moot as decided in moot court in the law school. It's entirely debatable still, because we still only have one sample. And even if we do, as we certainly will this century, and conceivably even in the remaining years of this decade, go to Mars, if Elon Musk has his way, or one of our landers on Mars will turn up more definitive proof that there's life on Mars than we already have. I happen to belong to the minority who believes that Viking found evidence of life on Mars in 1976. As you may remember, they had their biological experimentation package. And of course, this is the problem with extrapolating from a sample of one. We figured we could contrive experiments that would conclusively show whether or not there was life on Mars. And then we got results that were so exuberant in one of the chemical experiments that we don't know of any biological thing that could have given that result. And yet we don't know anything other than biology that could have given any value for that result. So I suspect retroactively we'll go back and say, oh yeah, we found life on Mars in 76. But it wasn't until sometime in the 2030s that we confirmed that result by boots on the ground on Mars and actually finding what we're looking for there. But even if that's the case, even if there is life on Mars, there's quite a reasonable possibility that that life on Mars and the life here on Earth share a common ancestor. As you all know, there's a significant transit traffic, much better than the LRT systems we have in Ontario, for getting meteoric material from the moon to Earth, from Earth to the moon, from the moon to Mars, from Mars, blah, 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 Mars to Earth. All of it gets thrown up and it gets caught in gravity wells, and some of it comes down. And some of it, as you know, famously, with the famous Martian meteorite, where they thought they had fossil evidence and it turned out probably not, that even if we find this, even if we find there's life on Mars, unless it's radically different from our life, not based on nucleic acids, not based on, doesn't share LUCA, the last universal common ancestor with us, That doesn't prove anything. It still doesn't prove the pervasiveness of life in the universe. But there may be. There's also, of course, the question of this great book called Rare Earth. I know rare earths are in the news as Donald Trump covets them all over the planet, including down beneath enormous amounts of ice in Greenland. But there's a great book called Rare Earth. You all know, I imagine the astronomy buffs here know the rare earth hypothesis, which says that the contingencies that went into making it possible for there to be a stable, long-term ecosystem on this planet, an environment conducive to life that lasted for almost the entire 4.5 billion years the world has been here, certainly for 3.8 billion, maybe 4 billion, maybe even a little more than 4 billion years that there's been life on this planet, that the contingencies that went into that are so one on top of another, on top of another, on top of another, that the likelihood of that being repeated frequently and possibly even at all anywhere else in the galaxy or the universe might be vanishingly small. Just as a very simple example, Earth and Venus, as you astronomy guys all know, and gals and people, they're almost exactly the same size and almost exactly the same surface gravity. But Venus is quite literally a hellhole where lead would melt on its surface because it has a huge atmosphere, as we had, until our moon skimmed most of it off. We have a freakishly large moon, as I'm sure you know. The ratio in size between our moon and its primary, us, is the largest of any in the solar system. It's a freakishly large moon and skimmed off an awful lot of the atmosphere of Venus. Of Earth. Or we would be a hellhole like Venus, as sterile as Venus almost certainly is, despite the much touted discovery a couple of years ago where they thought they found biotraces in the Venusian atmosphere. And that got a lot of news play. And then when they turned out to be wrong, as always, didn't get nearly the same amount of news play. So the universe might or might not be teeming with life. But science fiction writers, there's that famous saying, you can't convince somebody of something that goes contrary to their livelihood. So science fiction writers want to believe, like Fox Mulder, that the universe is in fact teeming with life. And that brings us to what we do in populating this universe, which may in fact not have much life in it at all. It may not have much intelligent life in it at all. Nonetheless, what do we do when we want to play that thought experiment of what alien civilizations might be like? And I started off by alluding to the creation of Star Trek by Gene Roddenberry. And certainly Gene Roddenberry had a method for creating an alien. He created Spock, as everybody knows. As you may know, in that same initial proposal that had the made-up version of the Drake equation, Roddenberry said Spock, who is probably half Martian, not half Vulcan. But even if he had said half Vulcan at the time, there was, as you know, before Einstein gave us relativity, there was good gravimetric evidence under Newtonian mechanics that there was a planet inferior, that is closer to the sun than Mercury, and its name was Vulcan. So that name was bandied around as there was a 10th planet, but it wasn't out that way. It was in towards the center. Anybody know where Vulcan is in the Star Trek universe? Any astronomy buff here know where it is? It orbits 40 Iridae. But Roddenberry didn't know any of that. And he didn't even know any real good astronomy, half Martian. It was a ridiculous notion, even in 65, that there might be people on Mars, or 64 when he was doing this. But he knew what he wanted. He wanted an alien that looked satanic. He wanted an alien with pointed ears. And he wanted an alien that had super strength. And so he came up with his alien description and then left it to others to backfill, to justify why Spock had those characteristics. Well, Vulcan must have a very thin atmosphere, and therefore you need larger ears to be able to hear. Vulcan must have a high gravity. Therefore, you would have what would be normal strength on Vulcan, but if you're consorting with Earth people, you would be much stronger than them, and so forth. It's a post hoc approach to creating aliens. And it's very often done in media science fiction. You look at the Cantina sequence, the Mos Eisley Cantina sequence, in what I will always think of as Star Wars, period, full stop, end of sentence, but is now Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope. that there's just a random collection of crazy looking aliens in there. And also in Return of the Jedi, when you see a similar band and cantina, and they're just made up to look weird and crazy. There's no justification for why they look that way. But for us, there is a justification for why we look the way we do. We look the way we do. I mentioned already the last universal common ancestor, which is the most recent unicellular life form from which all plants, animals, fungi, everything on the planet has common descent from there. There are a lot of different ways things from Luca, the last universal common ancestor, could have gone. And of course, Stephen Jay Gould, the Harvard paleontologist, famously wrote his book, Wonderful Life, about the Burgess Shale, which is Canadian, and the diversity of life forms and body plans that were being kind of just tried out randomly by multicellularism, which first appeared around 540, 550 million years ago. But very rapidly got whittled down through the Darwinian engine of what works and what doesn't, what has got a survival advantage to the forms that gave rise to us. And so we're all evolved from, every mammal on the planet is evolved from originally jawless fish to get to the first actual vertebrates. Before that, there were things like Pacaya, which was a notochord, but had no actual skeletal vertebrates, jawless fish, cartilaginous jawless fish. And they had a body plan that was suited not for this, not for sitting in a lecture hall, certainly not for shoveling snow in a Toronto winter, but a body plan that nonetheless is reflected in us today. They had two pectoral fins, which terminated in reinforced by bone projections with membranes between them that were the little fins. That's why we have fingers. That's why we have articulation at our shoulders, because we had fins here. We have legs for the same reason, and also with little toes, not nearly as dexterous anymore as our fingers are, that were the reinforcing struts on our pectoral fins. Our pelvic fins. We had a dorsal fin, we had a fin on our back. We gave up on that, which is good because none of you could be sitting down if we still had it. And we had a caudal fin, a tail fin, which many vertebrates, including many of our close relatives, many primates still have the caudal fin, tail. They still have the tail. So we converged on this. And if you look at every vertebrate today, they all you can see the fish. In fact, Niels Schubin wrote a great book about, I never say it quite right, Tiktaalik, which was found in the Canadian Arctic, which was a very early transitional form between basically amphibian and reptile that shows or fish and amphibian, I should say, that shows the basic body plan. That's called Your Inner Fish. It's an excellent book. So we can see a case for life that looks like us, and a giraffe looks like us. It has a head and two eyes, and it's got its fins have become long legs up here, and it's got fins at the back that became long legs back there. And yes, it has a very long neck, but you can see the same basic body plan. And all of that body plan structure goes back to what's required for an aquatic environment. An aquatic environment. We don't, we can swim or not swim as we choose, but we're not aquatic creatures anymore, but our body plan is based on that. So I mentioned Gene Roddenberry's approach. One of the science fiction writers, and is a dear friend of mine, who gets great credit for his inventive aliens, is Larry Niven. Larry Niven wrote the novel Ringworld. If all you know is Star Trek on the animated series, he wrote the episode The Slaver Weapon about the Kzinti, which were taken from his own fiction. But his most famous alien was, or is, the puppeteer. The puppeteer is described as looking like a three-legged centaur with two Cecil the Sea-6 sea serpent puppets on the end of its arms. Now, why anybody in the far future would remember Cecil the Sea-6 sea serpent with the same fondness that Larry Niven did from his childhood is a hard one to explain, but he says in his fiction that it was enjoying a camp revival. For those who've forgotten, it was just a sea serpent, an animated sea serpent. So a serpentine body with a head. His serpentine heads had mouths with knobbly lips that ultimately could be used as manipulative devices, one eye in each head, no brain in the head. The brain was between the shoulders at the back. And all of that is interesting, but I have a hard time seeing how that evolved from anything that had an aquatic ancestor, where you have two things sticking out front. No, natural selection is going to converge on something that isn't going to have drag. And even if you could come up with an explanation for how that body plan, the three legs, the two arms out front, came from something that once upon a time was streamlined for the aquatic world, then you have to ask yourself as a science fiction writer, how did it come to have civilization? Now, we have civilization because we build things. I always like to say that Carl Linnaeus, who gave us our name, and our name is, as a species, Homo sapiens, was an incredible act of arrogance to say we are Homo sapiens means the wise people. That's not us. Certainly not us if you read the headlines of the last couple of years. We're not particularly wise at all. There's a very good argument, although it'll never gain traction. A lot of paleoanthropologists and cultural anthropologists would say that Homo faber would be a better name. Faber, the people who make things. That's indisputable. We make things. And we make things because, and particularly we make things out of metal and so forth, and we harnessed fire because some of us were brave or foolhardy enough to see something on fire and put our hand in there to see if we could take it out. Because we could take it out with our hand, and maybe you would burn your fingers. But can you imagine how a civilization would develop if your only manipulatory appendage was your mouth, right beneath your eyes? You had to put, as a puppeteer, one or the other of your faces with your eyeball into the burning fire if you were going to pull out a burning stick and try to tame fire. I don't see how even justify the body plan from an aquatic ancestor, which I say is very hard with that body plan, how you can get from there to a technological civilization. And of course, in Drake's equation, those are two different things. Percentage of light, planets that give rise to light, percentage of those planets where the life reaches a level of civilization where they might be technological and capable of interplanetary communication, if not interplanetary travel. So yes, you can do it the Roddenberry way. I just want this look. Or you can do it and he wanted a look that meant something to people, a satanic look. Or you can do it the Larry Niven ways. I just want to freak people out on something really weird, some really weird stuff. But neither of those, I think, are particularly effective ways to do it. And, Larry Niven's novel Ringworld, a great, great novel, came out in 1970. So we're talking about a book that is now 56 years old. And it was groundbreaking in its day. But it wasn't the first attempt in science fiction to try to really break out of the old mold. The old mold was, of course, that you look like human beings everywhere. And I call this actually Spielberg's capitulation, because when he made Close Encounters of the Third Kind, which is a movie that Fox Mulder would love, but I can't think anybody who has a good skeptical background could really have much truck with, because it is simply buys into the entire flying saucer UFO mythology. But he has his aliens look like short, hairless human beings. I'm halfway there to being one of his superior aliens. And that's an easy way out. They're cute. And when he did it again a few years later, E.T. is still humanoid, right? And still looks cute to us and looks, looks like it could be related to us. There used to be some thought in science fiction that predates Spielberg. Well, maybe not birth of Spielberg, but Spielberg's filmmaking. There was a science fiction writer who was also a very good science writer, whose name was, his first initial was L for lion, L-Y-O-N, L. Sprague de Camp, L. Sprague de Camp. And de Camp argued quite vociferously. He was very much a scientific conservative. I don't mean socialist. I mean, he said, don't go on broad flights of fantasy. Remember Occam's razor, the simplest explanation is the easiest, most likely explanation to be true. And he said, we have existence proof of Homo sapiens. that this works for a technologically advanced civilization and as a life form. So he argued that, in fact, not only was it a random choice, but that evolution would tend to converge on bipedalism. No matter how many limbs you had, at least two of them would be free to be manipulators if you're going to be a civilization. So if you had 4 limbs, you're going to be bipedal. If you had 6 limbs, you could be quadrupedal, but you'd still have 2 and so forth, and maybe more. But you had to somehow have free limbs. You had to somehow have the sensory apparatus up high, which meant a move towards verticality for to be erect, so that you could see predators. You would have to have a system for taking in your nourishment and your air. And it's actually, although people choke to death because of this bad design we have, you could easily have them not cross the way they do currently. But still, one of the great things about having your nostrils up at the front of your head is that you can be buried to here in water and be in no danger for your life. Whereas Arthur C. Clarke once did a similar essay where he argued, oh yes, the human body would be very much the natural one, but it's inefficient because there's too much journeying in the human body. The air is taken in here, but processed here. Your nipples should in fact be your nostrils. Your food is taken in here and has to get down a narrow gullet before it can start being processed in earnest. Obviously, saliva does some digestive processing. No, your mouth would be in your stomach and so forth. And that was an interesting approach too. But again, it was a human chauvinism, a desire to look for something that wasn't, that justified us, that we were the pinnacle of civilization, some of it. This is what a civilized being is going to look like, something like us. And Spock certainly fits into that category. Interestingly, these guys came late to the game of extrapolating what the human form might look like more refined. Because in the full description of the talk, I said, ever since H.G. Wells's Martians, from the War of the Worlds, which was published in 1898, and is a spectacularly good novel to read today. If you haven't read it, if you've only seen the Tom Cruise movie, you've seen the lesser of the 2 movies. If you've only seen the Tom Cruise and the George Powell versions, you still haven't seen the full force of H.G. Wells's creation. And in neither of those do you get H.G. Wells's actual Martians. So the Martians in War of the Worlds look like the first impression is an octopus. Many of you will have seen the illustrations where it's this round central body and there are limbs out in front of it. But it's not an octopus. It is, as he says very clearly in the novel, it's a head. That's the only part of the body you need. You need your head with your sense organs, and there are eyes. You need, and your articulatory organ, in this case, a mouth on the Martians, just like us, and also ears. The Martians actually have a flat tympanic membrane on the top of their head, but all of that localized in the head, as they are. And you need manipulators. And so the tentacles are the hands, there's the head. And as he said, so much of our body is devoted to digestion. You all know that there's 10 meters of the large intestine coiled up inside, 10 meters of that wall over there, if you uncoiled it all from me, or any one of you, that it's incredibly inefficient, and that the processing of nutrition and all of that, as you become a technological civilization, you're going to offload all of that. And his Martians actually were literally vampires. They didn't suck blood. They had blood injected to them. The only nutrition they needed was nutrients through the blood, which is how blood nutrition gets moved around in our body. Oxygen gets moved around in our body. And so when they captured humans, they took our blood and they just injected it into themselves. So he had this notion of taking from where we are today and projecting forward and saying, okay, as we go farther ahead, he could already see that things were atrophying, that we didn't hate by we, I mean the people of England in 1898 and so forth. We didn't have the robust musculature of the great apes. We'd given up on it. We didn't need it anymore. Our tools did that for us. Even in Wells's days, who might not have had laser eye surgery, but you very well have eyeglasses. We understood that all of our human failings could be either we didn't need to do those things anymore, or we could correct them with technology. So he was directing himself forward, which is an interesting way to do it. And I think the right way to do it, but you have to pick, if you're going to do really interesting aliens, an interesting starting point. And my friend Kim Stanley Robinson, some of you will know him for his great Mars trilogy, Red Mars, Green Mars, Blue Mars, about the terraforming of the planet Mars. Said to me years ago, in fact, 1985, when I interviewed him for CBC Radio, science fiction, actually no, it's the second time I did it, 89. Science fiction is like historical fiction. You don't start in the present day and go forward because, and this goes back to what I said about statisticians trying to extrapolate from a sample of one, you have no vector. You have no direction to go from if you just start from the present day, anywhere. You have to start in the past, see what got us to the present day, and then extrapolate where that vector is leading forward. And that applies to cultural evolution, but it also applies to physical evolution. So one of the books I have on the table here, a novel of mine called Illegal Alien. And I was very much, I am very much interested in paleontology. I was accepted to study paleontology at U of T and geology, which is a sort of side route to paleontology at the University of Waterloo. Ended up becoming a science fiction writer instead, which is probably just as well, because I break things, and they get mad when you break the fossil. So, but I'm fascinated by the origin of life, as you may have gathered from some of the things I've said here. So I decided when I was going to develop my aliens in that particular novel, I got all kinds of different aliens, to go right back to that aquatic ancestor that most vertebrate life anywhere in the universe quite likely has. But we happen to have, and we have the body plan that's based on what happened to be the fish that won the evolutionary race back in the day. But there are other body plans that work perfectly well hydrodynamically. And so I thought, well, you could also, instead of having fins here and here, you could simply have 4 fins located equidistant around the body. And that will work very nicely as well, just like the 4 little fins on the back of an arrow. It works very nicely for stabilizing. But over time, just as in the giraffe is a classic example, the front legs become really long, the back legs less so. You could develop a life form where you have 4 limbs, 2 on the side and 2 on the front, one on the front and back, of different lengths. So you have the locomotive limbs being long limbs at the side, and you walk with great strides. And you have a front limb and a back limb. Now, as I was talking to Dan Falk, the great Canadian science journalist who's sitting here right now, I know many of you have heard Dan's talks here at this very venue before. Dan and I were talking over the paper that was published in Nature and got, I guess it was published yesterday, the day before, but the press coverage is out now, where they found a very early ancestor to us, similar to Pacaya in China, where it's not vertebrate yet, but it has a notochord, which is the precursor of a spinal cord, which is the precursor of a vertebral column. And it has 4 eyes. And nobody ever thought that our ancestor had 4 eyes. It has 4 eyes. That's quite interesting. When I wrote Illegal Alien, it came out in 1895, I had my precursor have 4 eyes. In my case, I had 2 eyes move to the front and 2 eyes move towards the back. It's only fairly recently, as you know, that that there are a lot of mammals that have stereoscopic vision. For the longest time, 2 eyes, the principal advantage of 2 eyes, was not available. You can see to the left and you can see to the right, but the fields of vision didn't overlap. They did in a few dinosaurs. Troodon as an example. Some of the T-Rex had some stereoscopic vision. But by and large, most birds don't. Beak is in the way, if nothing else. And very few mammals have it. But if you are going to have an advantage of depth perception, and you need probably a certain amount of neural sophistication to process stereoscopic images, so it may be that indeed it doesn't come till fairly late in evolution. It was the most intelligent dinosaur ever identified, Troodon. Had the largest brain-body mass ratio of any dinosaur. Also had perfect stereoscopic vision. Interesting, came at the same time as the big brain. Also had opposable thumbs. Interesting, came at the same time as the big brain. So I suspect all those things correlate together. In any event, my aliens walking along on their big legs here with one arm out front and one arm out back, or going backwards. One is as good as the other, you would think. But no, eventually you would come to a decision that one is your front and one is your back, which meant that you, unlike us, this is what we start doing in science fiction. We don't just talk about the physiology, we talk about the psychology. We have an enormously divided world right now. And what is the divide? It's between left and right. So notice how I did that carefully for your viewing pleasure, because I used right and left. When you saw left and right, left and right. And in the United States, they're almost exactly equal in number of supporters. And even when we have a phrase for when we're, conflicted on the one hand, but on the other hand, we don't have a series of stock phrases for 3 alternatives, 4 alternatives, 5. We distill everything down based on our physiology. And although some of us are lefties and some of us are righties, or in Latin, some of us are dexterous and the rest of you are sinister, we have no particularly one arm stronger than the other. Even if you're right-handed or left-handed, you're probably, in fact, I'm not very strong. I'm a writer. But I can win arm wrestling contests sometimes. Because people always want to arm wrestle with the right arm. And I say, no, let's do left. And because I'm a writer, and all my physical activity, all of it, is the keyboard. My arms are equally strong, left and right, whereas most people, their dominant hand is slightly stronger than their left, so I have a little bit better chance. I insulted the left-hander there. I said he was sinister and he's gone like a shot. I won't have that. We're going to be hearing from UTM HR. So my guys end up with a forehand that's in the direction that they're walking and a backhand that is in the direction that they're ignoring, by and large. And so there's always a right or a correct thing. And there's a strong side and a weak side to every argument, not two sides. Completely changes their psychology. I didn't invent this notion of trying to do interesting alien psychology. Of course not. I stand on the shoulders of giants. There's an American science fiction editor. His name is John W. Campbell Jr. And if you know anything about John W. Campbell Jr., you know him because he wrote the original novella that The Thing was based on, both the 1950s Howard Hawks film, James Arness as the monster, which was not a faithful adaptation at all. Ironically, Campbell was alive, and they did a completely inaccurate version of his story. And then John Carpenter, after Campbell was dead, did almost a verbatim translation. The dialogue, the characters, every action beat is directly from Campbell. But Campbell, The Thing, was his creation. But he was also the editor of what is now known as Analog Science Fiction and Fact magazine, the top-selling English language science fiction magazine, has been for over 50 years now. But and Campbell gave it that name. But back when he first took over editing it, he called it, he inherited it from a previous, it was called Astounding Stories. But Campbell said, I want to see something that thinks as well as, and he was a sexist bastard, and this is what he said, as well as a man, but not like a man. And that challenge was sort of floating out there in the field. And even actually before Campbell said that, a few years before that, there was a writer who really upended the field of science fiction. His name was Stanley G. Weinbaum. And the reason you don't know him is because he died within 18 months of his first publication. He would have been as big as Asimov, Clarke, Heinlein, had he continued to produce stories as important as his story, A Martian Odyssey. A Martian Odyssey was his attempt to respond to that, something that thinks as well as a human being, but not like a human being. And his example, one of the things that he said, here's a classic example. We always use the same noun to mean the same thing. Now, as a writer, I'll tell you, if you've said house in the first sentence, you might say home and domicile, mix it up a little bit. But house always means the same thing as home or domicile. Words have fixed meanings. His alien Tweel, and it's a story about a human stranded briefly on Mars trying to communicate with this alien, is flummoxed by the fact that for Tweel, words don't mean the same thing twice. You have to remember what they meant the last time he used them if you're going to make sense of what he's saying now, because he's using a completely different term for the same concept. It was a different way of thinking. And whether, you can wrap your head around it, I don't know. He also, in that story, introduced us to silicon-based life. Now, if you look at your periodic table, that carbon is here and silicon is directly below it. Carbon is incredibly versatile in terms of forming compounds and bonds. And silicon, not nearly as versatile, but the most versatile. It's the number 2 competitor, right? It's like Star Trek is number 1 and Star Wars is number 2, right? It's not as good, but it's there. You have to acknowledge it. Silicon is the Star Wars of compound making atoms. He has that in there. And I know I've been rambling probably longer than I meant to. So I'm going to wrap it up by talking about one last thing. There's a phrase, and I was doing some research today to try and find out where it first appeared. And although phrases like it date back to the 1800s, I couldn't find the phrase life as we know it before Star Trek. It's used in 2 episodes in the first season of Star Trek by Spock, of course, who refers to it. Most famously when he talks about the Organians, who were the ones who stopped the first war between humans and Klingons. And Spock, they turn out to be incorporeal energy beings. As Spock says, I would say they're as far above us on the evolutionary ladder as we are above the amoeba. We don't talk about evolutionary ladders anymore, but forgive 60 years ago. But he said, not life as we know it at all. And we have that phrase now, Lawki, L-A-W-K-I, life as we know it. What's most interesting in science fiction, I'll just leave you with this provocative thought, is writing about life not as we know it. Completely alien forms of life, not based possibly on nucleic acids, not based possibly on carbon chemistry, not based possibly on the Darwinian engine of survival of the fittest. And I'll jump straight through, I'll go past Fripp Hoyle's The Black Cloud, which was an amorphous cloud that turned out to be intelligent, and go right to my favorite example, which is Stanislaw Lem's Solaris. Solaris is a planet, another solar system, completely covered pole to pole by an ocean, a thick organic soup. And that whole planet is one single organism that has developed intelligence. And it's about humans in a little station orbiting above the planet, not quite orbiting, they're actually held above the planet by gravitational propulsors, but trying to communicate between these little puny things. This is a life form that didn't evolve through natural selection because there was no competition on its world. It's the only life form. It never occurred to it that there might be other life forms because it had never seen any other animate object in its life. And it tries to communicate with the humans, and the humans, unfortunately for the humans, it communicates more or less telepathically, but only seems to tie into the subconscious thoughts of the humans. And so keeps bringing back to life for them out of its primordial ooze manufacturing replicas of the wife who committed suicide and the guy who had had horrible things, all the horrible things that lurk in your subconscious. But it's a brilliant example of life not as we know it, right down to how it's structured. The actual energy force of Solaris is not biochemistry like ours, biochemical neuronal chemistry. It's actually got, it's made out of neutrinos, which we would not have think would aggregate together very well, held together by force fields that seem to be generated by the force of thought in a kind of a parallel to the observer phenomenon in particle physics, that as long as Solaris is thinking about these things, they stay coherent. And if it were ever to cease to function as an intelligent being, all of that would collapse. Anyways, that's just a little bit of the smorgasbord of all the different ways we do it in science fiction. Strange new worlds, new life, and new civilizations. They may not exist. I don't want my parents to send me to bed without my supper. But if they do, they're going to be not only, and this is JBS Haldane, not only queerer than we suppose, but queerer than we can suppose. Thanks very much. Product placement. Did you all see that picture of William Shatner eating cereal? It was all over the internet the last couple of days. Somebody got a selfie of him eating cereal in the front of his car. No? Oh, okay. Well, then this will not interest you, except that it turns out it was an advertising plan leading up to a Super Bowl commercial that Shatner will be doing to promote a brand of cereal. But it was very clever. It goes to the anti-truth reality we live in. It was posted as if by just a netizen, a citizen who, oh my God, he was parked right next to me at the red light and he was eating cereal out of his bowl. It went viral and it was all manufactured. Sorry.
Oh, thank you very much, Robert.
Any questions? Way over here.
So I finished Quantum Night last night, and I was blown away. My first book by you, thank you. And then at the end, you listed all of the reference books, which I don't remember seeing like at least 2 dozen reference books, and I was talking textbooks.
Yes.
So you seem to read a lot. Is this part of your process? You do a lot of research, and it's very tempting.
I was just talking to Neil about this. I don't like writing. I like research. I love research. And every year or two, I have to squeeze off a novel to make some money out of my research. But seriously, it is the thing I enjoy the most. And people had been saying, for instance, some of you picked up Starflex tonight. Well, you must have done a lot of research. Yeah. And then they start asking for the sources. So in more recent books, I have started putting in a bibliography, which is very unusual for fiction, of the nonfiction works that I relied upon. And there's a huge one in Quantum Night. There's a huge one, I think, at the back of the Oppenheimer Alternative. And a number of the other ones have it as well. Yeah, I just love doing research, but also some of you may have picked up some anti-Star Wars sentiment on my part. Only because people confuse Star Wars with science fiction. Science fiction is about things that plausibly might happen. Fantasy is about things that never could happen. Star Wars is fantasy fiction about a wizard and a magical force, cosplaying, as we say today, or masquerading as science fiction. So when I have science in my books, I want people to know that it's legit. And the rule of thumb for reading a Rob Sawyer book is if anything is stated to be a scientific fact as established before the date of the book, then it's real. Anything my characters say, I've discovered this, or this is the invention of them, it's a reasonable extrapolation. But if I say, in 1972, it was shown that, blah, 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 that mitochondria were originally free-floating separate life forms that only led from a symbiotic relationship with cells. That's true. Lynn Margulies really did show that at that time. So yeah, I want to justify people say, it's the thing I hate the most is, oh, that's just science fiction. No, you mean that's just fantasy. It can never happen. When you say that's, and in fact, one of my characters says in, I think it's in Downloaded, says, it's science fiction, meaning, of course, that it's a rational extrapolation from what we know now to what plausibly might be. And I underpin that with the bibliographies to prove that the point. Somebody else? Yes, Alan.
What is your two-part question? What is your favorite book of yours? I think I heard you say Oppenheimer Alternative, and if so, why? And corollary, what is your favorite science fiction novel of all time?
I'll start with the second one first. It's Gateway by Frederick Pohl, P-O-H-L, and Frederick the German way with no C in it, Frederick Pohl. I'm lucky enough to have won the Hugo for Best Novel of the Year, the Nebula for Best Novel of the Year, and the John W. Campbell Memorial Award for Best Novel of the Year. They are respectively the award given by readers, the award given by writers, and the award given by an academic Blue Ribbon panel for 3 different books. Took me 3 books to win those. Gateway won all 3. It's just a spectacular novel. There's just not been a finer science fiction novel than Gateway by Frederick Pohl. No way. Well, it's about the discovery of a sort of a interstellar Stargate network left behind by aliens who are long gone. So the posits aliens, the aliens never appear in the book, but it is a brilliant, brilliant book. Of my own, yes, it's the Oppenheimer alternative. It was one that I did more research on than anything else. For every book that I do, some of you, I've been fortunate, have been reading me my whole career. My first novel came out 36 years ago. For me to keep being interested in doing work at this late stage of my life, it has to be a challenge. And in the Oppenheimer alternative, I set out, because it was kind of a number of things that gave rise to that novel. But one was a letter that I got from my novels, Wait, Watch, and Wonder, which are about the World Wide Web gaining consciousness. Thank you very much. And somebody wrote to me and said, I don't think Caitlin, who was the main human character in those books, I don't think she would have done that. And I wrote back and said, as the world's foremost authority on that character, I can assure you that's exactly what she would have done in that circumstance. So for Oppenheimer alternative, every single character in the book is a real human being. Every single character in the book is a famous human being. And although they're all dead, with the exception of Peter Oppenheimer, Oppenheimer's son is still alive. They're all dead. So you can write whatever you want about them. Libel law doesn't apply to dead people. Not that I want to libel anybody, but I had free reign, except that a lot of people who knew them are still alive. And I wanted to pass muster with them. So set a challenge where I was not the world's foremost authority on these people, and have those people who knew them say that I'd done a good job. And you mentioned you had read American Prometheus, which is the nonfiction with the Pulitzer Prize winning biography of Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer never wrote an autobiography, by Kai Bird and Martin J. Sherwin. Marty Sherwin gave me a blurb for Oppenheimer alternative. He loved my book. And that was vindication in the case of Oppenheimer, but also Greg Benford, the great science fiction writer Gregory Benford. So do you know whose grad student Gregory Benford was? Edward Teller. So he said, you captured Edward Teller. I captured every one of these characters. I'm told I captured accurately. The challenge was hard, and that I pulled it off makes me very proud of that book. So that's why it's my favorite. Somebody else? Yes.
First, I'd like to say thank you for all the great books you've written. I've got about 20 of them at home, and I've loved every one of them.
Here. Thank you. I thought you guys would push my ego. Thank you.
I love that one.
You're the man. You said Starflex. Love that one right there. Still some copies left. Go ahead.
So I saw a TV show about 4 or 5 years ago with Brian Cox was the narrator. He's a British guy.
Oh, I know him well. I mean, I don't know him well. You mean Brian Cox, the astrophysicist?
Yes.
Not Brian Cox, the star of Succession.
That's right.
The TV, right?
Right. Yes.
They're friends. Did you know that?
I didn't know that.
They became friends because they kept getting confused with each other. They have the exact same name, and they're both British. Well, Brian Cox, the actor, is actually Scottish. But anyway, go ahead.
So this show was about, he was looking at what he thought was the possibility that there has been some kind of technologically sophisticated society in the Milky Way galaxy at any point in its history. And his conclusion, based on various factors like in Rare Earth, for instance,
Yes.
another great book, and also that we've never seen any indication around any star of any kind of
Mega structure. Yeah.
any kind of production or anything like that. And we've never seen any signals or anything. He said at the conclusion of the show, he thinks there's only ever been one technological civilization in the Milky Way galaxy, and it's us. Just wonder what you think of that.
So Arthur C. Clarke was asked about this same thing. He said there are only two possible answers to the question of whether there are other civilizations in the universe. And the two answers are yes and no. And both answers are astonishing. No matter which one is the right answer, it's an astonishing answer. I think, so I was going to, if my talk had not rambled as much as it had, I was going to conclude by talking about the Fermi paradox. Speaking of scientists who are in the Oppenheimer alternative, Enrico Fermi. And Fermi famously said simply, if the universe is teeming with life, where are they? And an answer that a number of people have converged on is that it's impossible to survive technological adolescence. You may pop in all over the universe, but as soon as you develop the technology to, we developed radio in 1895. That's when radio was developed, the first radio broadcast. And we developed atomic bombs exactly 50 years later, in 1945. And we managed to not destroy ourselves through nuclear Armageddon, but are very close to destroying ourselves through climate Armageddon, which was caused by our technological civilization. So it's quite legitimate thinking that even if intelligent life does emerge, the period of time that it survives before it does something catastrophically stupid and destroys itself is so small compared to, as everybody knows from watching The Big Bang Theory, that the universe is 14 billion years old in the opening credits song, that the overlap is so unlikely to occur. That any like the 50, 100, 200, even 1,000 years, even 1,000,000 years is such a tiny fraction of the lifespan of the universe that for us to overlap seems very slim. But yes, I think it's quite legitimate argument to say, yeah, we are a fluke, and it makes it even more a responsibility to look after this ecosystem and to make sure we don't extinguish ourselves. Unless it turns out that the only way to save this ecosystem is for us to step aside and leave it alone. We'll call them question 1 and question 2, all right? You were asking about the anthropological issues that relate to humanity, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I wrote, actually, the one that I won the Hugo Award for is a book called Hominids. I'm fascinated by particularly paleoanthropology, but anthropology in particular, in general. I mean, how can you not be? It's about us, right? It's like, oh, they have a whole science about us? That's a cool science. Whereas mycology, the study of, fungus, right? Not so keen on that. It doesn't interest me. Even on my pizza, I don't want any of it. So, yeah, I'm fascinated, and it is so hard for a science fiction writer to create a believable cultural history, which is a very difficult thing to do. I think some people have done it really well. I like to think I've done it well from time to time, but it is hard, and sometimes also for the purposes of science fiction, not necessary. You're trying to tell a story that's usually a thought experiment of some sort. So you're juxtaposing two different opposing worldviews. And it really doesn't matter all that much to the reader or to the intellectual argument you're making, how those two opposing worldviews came into existence. And so it's often not paid a lot of attention to in science fiction. I think it should be, and I think I did a lot of creative paleoanthropology in Hominids, Humans, and Hybrids, my trilogy I wrote about a parallel world where Neanderthals survived to the present day and we did not, for instance. But it's a very hard thing to write about. I'll come back for your second question after I get one from somebody else, if there's somebody else I want to share. Yes.
So you get together with other science fiction writers like Kim Stanley Robinson and Rowan, and you're having a few beers.
Yes.
What do you talk about?
Who's going to pick up the check? So honestly, we writers get together and bitch about publishers and agents more than we talk about big ideas, to be perfectly honest. That said, tomorrow there are two great Southern Ontario science fiction writers, two of my colleagues, who in theory are coming over tomorrow. They live in Waterloo, whether the weather will allow them to come. James Allen Gardner and Paddy Ford. You possibly don't know Paddy because he's only published short fiction, but James Allen Gardner is a Hugo nominee, a Theodore Sturgeon Award winner, and so forth. And we do talk. The first thing we do is they come over and they spend around 6 hours at Carol and my place. They come every couple of months. Talk about what books we've been reading. And mostly it's nonfiction. And, either, you got to read this one, you got to read that one, and so forth. I'm writing right now about split brain studies, which are fascinating because the two hemispheres have very different ways of viewing the world. And, for severe epilepsy treatments, Michael Gazzaniga and others, Roger Sperry, have cut the corpus callosum, the information superhighway between the two hemispheres. And it turns out the human being goes on pretty much just fine without that interplay. And yet the two halves have very different ways of approaching the world. You can try to experiment. So Jim had mentioned a book about that called The Master and His Emissary, which was absolutely fascinating. And then I would say to him, well, I've just been reading this book or whatever. So we talk about what has been giving us good ideas. And one of the things that I think most science fiction writers understand is nobody can write your book your way. Another one of my great friends here in the GTA is Robert Charles Wilson, Hugo Award-winner, lives in Thornhill. And we talk all the time about big ideas in science and philosophy and so forth. Because I'm not afraid of tipping my hand at what I'm working on, because he'll write something completely different even if we choose the same source material. But that's what we talk about. But the number one thing when two writers who haven't seen each other for a long time is bitching and moaning about your agent, your editor, and the publisher. That's just the way it is. It's a business. Somebody else? Yes.
Ask a question about the frictions amount of AI written publishing that.
Yes.
What kind of challenges do writers face today, especially with the emergence of possible AGI in the next couple of years?
Yeah.
Like, what struggles do you face as a writer, knowing that the competition from these?
So 5 years ago at Christmas, I was talking to my buddy Spider Robbins, another fine Canadian science fiction writer, who's Bowen Island, British Columbia. And Spider said, Rob, we got in at the right time, we made out like bandits, and we're getting out at the right time. Because AI, amongst other things, is going to put an end to our profession. It's also, I think, going to put the end to culture, ultimately. By which I mean this. A writer has an audience. Some of us are lucky to have very big audiences, some have huge audiences, some have audiences of only a small number of people. But whatever work they've created is shared by a variety of people. And there's certainly a interrelationship between my brain and all my readers, but there's also the dialogue that goes on between readers about the same book. As I just mentioned, Master and His Emissary, I should say, the book that Jim Gardner recommended to me. But AI is not going to just make fiction. It's going to make bespoke fiction. So you're going to say to the prompt, I like Rob Sawyer, except when he goes off on his left-wing liberal Canadian atheistics. And he drops the F-bomb sometimes, and I think that's gratuitous. And I wish he would stop making references to Star Trek, for God's sake, in every chapter. But otherwise, I like his stuff. Write me a Rob Sawyer novel. And it's written for you, and it's delivered in 5 minutes, and you're the only person in the world who reads it. So there's no reason to buy a book from me, because you get the more perfect version of Rob Sawyer by your definition of what would be the perfect version of my book. And you're the only one who wants it. So it's the death of culture, because it's no longer a shared experience. We've rightfully dispensed with, only the last 10 or 15 years, the canon, the white, Western European codified texts that were considered the cornerstone of Western civilization. And now all of us hopefully read much more broadly than we used to, and understand that there's great ideas and culture coming from all over the world. But that's going to disappear. Any notion that there are key works that everybody should read. If you're reading science fiction, if you haven't read Asimov, Clarke, Heinlein, the big three, you probably haven't been reading enough science fiction. You don't know enough about the field to have an opinion about what's good and what's bad, for instance. So, yeah, it's an existential threat. But not just to me, to teachers, to lawyers, to accountants, to doctors, to everybody who works with their mind. It's an existential threat. And what's astonishing to me is that we just rolled over. A bunch of super rich people said, here it is. And I hear over and over again, well, there's no putting the genie back in the bottle. In 1945, when the United States decided to go ahead with an unnecessary dropping of 2 bombs on Japan, given that Japan was already making back-channel overtures to surrender, we nonetheless haven't done it since, used atomic weapons. Oh, that's actually something we don't want to have in our lives. So we're not going to use them. So far, so good. But everybody seems to be saying, well, what are you going to do? They want us to have AI, and now it's in Word, and now it's in our phones, and now it's everywhere. And There's no saying no to it. A friend of mine said, and not a friend of mine, but a guy at a science convention recently said, well, if we don't win this race, China's going to win. And I said, what exactly will they win? Putting most of their workforce out of work? In what way is that a victory? Putting an end to Chinese culture? In what way is that a victory? Let them win. If you want to defeat a country, let them put all their efforts into eliminating not only the intellectual labors of human beings, but the artistic labors of human beings, the things that give life meaning. So yeah, it's absolutely an existential threat. And I'm against it. Yes.
Does that mean you're not going to write it?
So it's an interesting question. I'm about to embark on a 3-month residency at an Institute for Advanced Study in Germany, patterned after the one that I write about in the Oppenheimer Alternative, the one at Princeton. And my obligation while I'm there is to work on a new novel. So I've got one more novel that I will do for sure. But after that, I don't know. I don't need the money. I appreciate all you guys who bought books from me, but I'm set for life. I'm a member of the Order of Canada. I don't need the accolades. I have 26 novels. The 26th one comes out in May. The one I'm writing now is my 27th. Been a great career. I don't have a need or a compulsion to keep doing this.
It's a lot of work.
Oh, but you know, it's the only way. I mean, yes, it is, but it's the only work I'm qualified for. As I said to, I guess it was to Neil, that the only job I could have had that would have been good for me, that isn't my job, is Dan's job. I'm an intellectual journalist, and that's a great job. A science fiction writer can do that, and a science journalist can do that. There's almost nobody else who gets to do that. So yeah, there may or may not be more books after the one that comes out in May, the one that I'm determined to finish. Who knows? We'll see.
We'll cross it.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Way at the back.
You mentioned you like doing research for things.
Yes.
Get yourself started.
How do I get myself started writing? So, well, that's a good question. You reach a point in your research where the new material you're reading is redundant. You know everything at that point. And if I have a marketable skill, Randy, where's Randy? Mentioned Randy Atwood. There you go. Randy mentioned we first met on, I think it was CBC News World talking about shuttle flight. CBC or the BBC or NPR, whoever calls me up and asks me for an interview, will tell me what they want me to be an expert on this afternoon, and I become an expert in like 6 hours. I have an enormous facility for absorbing material and understanding it very quickly. So once I reach the point where I'm not getting any benefit out of further research in the topic, then I start formulating what I want to say based on the research. To give you an example, some of you bought Quantum Night. We sold out of it now at this point, but Quantum Night was a response to some reviewers saying, particularly Weight Watch and Wonder, but in just general my oeuvre, Sawyer is so optimistic about the future. It's almost Pollyanna-ish. It's almost naive. And he's never grappled with the notion of evil. And so I spent months and months and months, most of a year, researching the science of evil. What do we know scientifically about evil? And that led me to psychopathy. It led me to a variety of other areas. And once I concluded my research, I said, well, what do I want to say about evil? And I came up with my thematic statement for that book, which was the most pernicious lie humanity has ever told itself is you can't change human nature. In fact, we change human nature all the time. We were talking over dinner about how huge an event it was, at least for the United States, to have an African-American man become president of the United States. And the only way that was possible, or the only way that women had the power that they have today, besides all of the good and necessary and important work that was done by African-Americans and by women, was by a whole bunch of bigoted white men who were in power saying, oh, I was wrong. I was wrong. This guy is really good. This Barack Obama is nothing what I thought it would be like to vote for that guy. Oh, this woman actually who just performed open heart surgery on me and I'm still alive. But hey, she's actually pretty competent. A whole bunch of people had to change their fundamental nature. And it happened not as a generational change. We used to say, Thomas Kuhn,
Scientific revolution.
but the title of his book about the nature of scientific revolutions.
Structure.
Structure of scientific revolutions. A big part of it was expire or retire. That is, the people who held a certain position, like that the continents couldn't possibly drift, had to die or at least retire before J. Tuzo Wilson and the others that realized that obviously it was blindingly obvious that Africa and South America once fit together. Yeah, we do change human nature all the time, and it doesn't have to be that generational shift. And that's what I ended up wanting to say in that book. Somebody else? We're getting close to the end here, I know. Well, then I'll come back to you who had your two questions. Oh, I'm sorry. I'll take this one and then I'll take yours.
I disagree with you. You were saying that AI will be able to write better novels. I think of J.K. Rowling that was rejected by
Yes.
publishing house after publishing house because it didn't fit the mold of a book, and she only sold 2,000 copies of Harry Potter, or
The original Bloomsbury edition, yeah.
and I still think there's scope for ingenuity that AI cannot create.
I hope you are right. I absolutely hope you are right.
Yeah.
No, you had a second question. So the question was about when I'm naming a character, how do I decide what kind of name? Apropos of our discussion tonight about extraterrestrials, you have to, if you're going to give them a name that can be spoken, then you presuppose that they have a way of generating sounds that we can hear and transcribe. Larry Niven, who I mentioned earlier, was famous for having alien names that were 16 or 18 letters long. There's an alien named in his novel Protector, which is PHS. He wanted to generate a sound that was alien, but he could still transcribe. But if the alien doesn't have speech or doesn't speak with sound, for instance, there's a great story by Michael Bishop called it's Transfigurations in the novel version, Death and Designation amongst the Asadi in the novelette version, where an alien race communicated entirely because they had the ability to change their eye color. And so both eyes are red, green, blue, red, blah, blah, blah. You can't put that into sound. There's no way to give those aliens names that could be articulated because there's no correspondence. So they get given names. Larry Niven, his puppeteers, all of them take names out of Greek mythology because humans simply can't make the musical, two-tonal, harmonizing one mouth and the other musical flute-like sounds that are their actual names. So Nessus and Charon and Nike are the names that they take for themselves. Sometimes I do that kind of hard work, and sometimes I do the easy work. So I wrote a trilogy about dinosaurs having been transplanted to an alien world just before the asteroid hit, and the main character in that series, his name is Afsan, and that's the acronym for my high school science fiction club, NASFA, spelled backwards. North Sea Association for Science Fiction Addicts. So sometimes it just means something to me. I have in Starplex, I have an alien who, his name is Rhombus, because he has no articulated voice. Oh, he does. He can make human sounds, so to say. But the pictogram for his name in his own language looks a bit like a rhombus, like a parallelogram with the sides aren't, all the sides are parallel, but they're not right angles to each other, blah, blah, blah. So his name is Rhombus, R-H-O-M-B-U-S, because that's what his little written name looks like when we give it an articulation. As long as you have a sensible system for it, so they're internally consistent, it makes sense. But remember that one of the problems that is pervasive in science fiction is the idea that any alien world is going to be a monoculture. So in the original Star Trek, all Klingon males had first names that started with the letter K. And we finally met a female that started with an F. Mara was the female. Kang, Kor, Koloth. and so forth, we were all K. And all the Vulcan male first names started with S and the female ones with T apostrophe. And that might be true for a culture on Vulcan or a culture on Kronos, which is the Klingon home planet, but probably not true for all the cultures there. My name is Robert, which is an Anglo-Saxon name. When I was born in 1960, it was a very common name. So were David, Paul, John, and William. And if you look today at common names, William and Robert have fallen by the wayside. They're Anglo-Saxon, but David, Paul, and John, which are biblical names, are still being used quite frequently, as is the most common boy's name in Canada last year was, anybody know? Noah, right? Biblical names endure, whereas nobody wants to be named for the Anglo-Saxon dominant culture anymore. So Robert is, even though it means shining with fame, which is way better than Philip, whatever Philip I'm doing there. Even though it means shining with fame, nobody wants to use that. So it's got to be an internal consistency for the culture, but remember that your planet may have a variety of cultures on it. Anyway, each have their own system, just as Chinese and Japanese and French and German and Dutch all have different kinds of naming systems. And indeed, in China, I was friends with, as we would call him over here, Cixin Liu, who wrote The Three Body Problem, but he's Liu Cixin in China, right? Because the surname goes first in Chinese, right? I'm probably not doing justice to the pronunciation, but he wrote The Three Body Problem. Yes.
Can you share any books or things that you've read that have challenged any core beliefs about the paradigm shift for you?
Any books that
you've read that have challenged some core beliefs?
the core beliefs. Carolyn and I just listened as an audiobook to what I thought, and I told Dan about this, too late for him to include it in his roundup on Quillen, Quirks and Quarks for the best nonfiction science books of the year. A book called The Last Extinction by Goethe. It's Goethe's last name. Come to me. Keller, I think.
Keller, yeah.
Yes, who is a paleontologist who said, no question that an asteroid hit the Yucatan. Nobody disputes that. But she shows, I think, quite conclusively, she's not the first to argue this, in peer-reviewed journals such as Science and various geological journals, that the asteroid impact predated the death of the dinosaurs by 200,000 years, that it was not the causative agent for the dinosaur extinctions, that in fact it was, as she had argued for many, many decades, the climate effects of volcanism in the Deccan Traps in India had caused the dinosaur extinction. And I had bought into, and I had met and interviewed Louis Alvarez, the Nobel laureate, who had put forward this theory. I'd interviewed him in 1980, 84, I guess, at his office at the University of California, Berkeley. And Goethe makes the point that he has Nobel disease. Nobel disease is when you win a Nobel Prize and you think you're an expert on everything. And he's a physicist, and he's looking at core samples and cannot see the paleontological evidence that's in the core samples. So yeah, that most recently, The Last Extinction by Goethe, Keller, Keller, I think, absolutely turned me around. I'm a lifelong paleontology fan and reader, and I now am very dubious that the asteroid impact was the causative agent. So yeah, that was a recent one. It's a book from last year, a recent one that absolutely challenged my preconceptions. And we're running out of time, so I'm going to let Alan tell you the bad news, which is that we're running out of time, but I sold his letter. Thank you all.
I don't think I will ever see or read any science fiction in the future with aliens without wondering now about their backstory in terms of how their body shape was derived from an evolutionary. That was very interesting. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank you both, Robert and Carolyn, for coming out. And I'd like to thank all of you for braving the cold and enjoying tonight's talk, I hope.